Hello, I'm Jordan Crenshaw, Vice President of the U.S. Chamber's Technology Engagement Center, or CTEC, and welcome to another CTEC Tech Talk. Our Tech Talk series hosts thought leaders and policymakers in the technology sector, and our Tech Talk hosted 2 weeks ago actually talked about a very important issue on IT modernization and the launch of the new Congressional IT Modernization Caucus. CTEC, too, has led efforts in this area by the creation of our new digital transformation working group and a new campaign to highlight the need to modernize government IT to help citizens get better access to services and improve efficiency. Today, we're joined by one of the federal leaders in this space, Sanjay Gupta. Sanjay Gupta joined the U.S. Small Business Administration in January 2017 as Chief Technology Officer from the private sector. He brings to SBA an exclusive combination of experience as a CIO and a former managing partner in consulting and an adjunct research analyst. Sanjay has offered over 20 research papers focused on advice and guidance for CIOs and boards. In addition, he's also a judge on the CIO 100 Annual Awards Judging Panel and ACT AIC Innovation Awards Judging Panel. So, Mr. Gupta, thank you very much for joining us today. We're glad to have you.
Jordan, thank you for inviting me on your Tech Talk show. I'm glad to be here today.
Well, let's get into it. Before working in the federal government, Mr. Gupta, you worked in the private sector. Can you explain a little bit about what drove you to public service?
Yeah, certainly. I was brought on board as the Chief Technology Officer at the U.S. Small Business Administration in 2017, like you said, with an explicit mandate of helping modernize IT for the Small Business Administration. And let me just give a little bit of quick snapshot of my background, and hopefully that'll help address the question about what drove me here. So I have now been a CIO, CTO, both in the public sector and now in the public sector and previously in the private sector for over 15 years. And prior to that, like you were mentioning, I led a consulting practice with Gartner, and I've also had the opportunity to author and publish 20 plus research papers with IDC, informing my fellow CIOs, CTOs, and board of directors on the nexus of business and technology. While I've been here at the SBA a little over 5 years, I've had the distinct opportunity to lead strategic transformations here as well. So just a quick vignette on that. In 2017, when I came on board, I led the SBA's cloud journey in 82 calendar days. That became highly instrumental in helping SBA's mission of disaster response when the three major hurricanes, Harvey, Irma, and Maria, hit the southern part of the United States in the fall of 2017. So it allowed us to scale up really quickly. So that cloud foundation helped us almost immediately as I got that in place. And of course, now I will talk about in the COVID response as well. In 2018, I led a 90-day Trusted Internet Connections modernization pilot with the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, with the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS, and the General Services Administration, GSA, which basically informed the Trusted Internet Connections, or TIC 2.0 policy update to TIC 3.0. In 2019, similarly, I led a 90-day modernization pilot with the Department of Homeland Security's Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation, or CDM, project team, helping them look at how we can achieve the CDM objectives in the cloud as well. So in a sense, in 2020 and 21, I've had the opportunity to lead SBA's exponential scaling to respond to the nation's largest ever economic recovery initiative. So in summary, basically, I've had the opportunity to do some major transformations previously to my role of SBA, and then here at the SBA as well, I've led some major transformations, not only for the SBA, but also help the larger federal government look for a way to move forward. So hopefully that gives a little idea about what drove me here.
Well, you mentioned the work that was done during COVID, and SBA was tasked with processing more than $1 trillion in grants and loans during the pandemic. As CTO at the Small Business Administration, how did you and your team prepare for this, and what actions did you have to take to really fulfill this requirement?
Yeah, certainly. So when the COVID-19 global pandemic came around in March of 2020, I think none of us, including us at the SBA or myself included, had an idea of the scope and the magnitude and the volume and velocity of transactions we would be dealing with. Certainly we were getting geared up, the technology foundation that I talked about, the cloud modernization, certainly was of immense help to us as we progress through the various programs like the Paycheck Protection Program, the Economic Disaster Injury Loan programs, and many other grant programs like the Restaurant Revitalization Fund or the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant Fund, and many of the programs that were the flagship of the economic recovery initiatives. As I look back, the modernization foundation that I'd helped establish at the SBA starting in 2017 played a vital role in our ability to scale exponentially almost overnight. So let me kind of share a couple, three examples probably that'll illustrate this point a little further. So the Cloud Foundation I had established in 2017 and the cloud-based cybersecurity model was really instrumental in our ability to scale up quickly, but also secure and protect the SBA environment and our staff, and more importantly, the customer citizen data that we deal with day in and day out. And if you can think about it, we had already started migrating to a cloud-based secure connectivity solution even before the pandemic. And what that was doing was replacing our virtual private network or VPN, which most organizations had a choke point and a productivity issue because everybody was launching their services for the virtual workforce using a VPN. So we were able to kind of leapfrog that because some of the modernization work we'd already begun doing there. As the SBA staff increased, at our peak, we went up about 4 times the size we were pre-pandemic. And obviously all of these workforce was coming in on board in a virtual fashion. And as you may recall, right around the time of the pandemic in March and April timeframe of 2020, the global pandemic had wreaked havoc on the global supply chain. So what that meant was laptops were not easily available, and there were long delays in making those even available once you even ordered them. So one of the solutions that myself and my team came up with was a creative and innovative way where we asked all of our virtual staff that was onboarding really 3 simple questions. A, do you have a computer, any kind of computer, right? Do you have access to the internet? And would you be able to click on a link? And usually the answer was yes to all 3. And what that did was we allowed them to connect into our SBA's cloud-based virtual desktop environment. It's a mouthful of things, but in essence, they used their computers, their personal computers. They had access to some form of connectivity, the internet connectivity, and we gave them a link, a secure link, to connect into our environment. And now they were immediately productive. We were able to ramp up the staff, which was obviously very important for our mission delivery. Just really quick 2 other examples I should just mention here is that, so early on in the pandemic, I was looking at our dashboards for getting a global view of our network traffic and where it was originating from. And very quickly, I realized that we had network traffic that was originating from outside the continental United States. So working with my CISO, or Chief Information Security Officer, we quickly launched something called geofencing. In simple words, what it does is it looks for your originating IP address. And if it is not from the United States or continental United States in our case, we basically blocked it. So this is one just simple example. Within a few hours, we were able to implement geofencing on all of our external portals, and we were able to block traffic that was coming from the overseas. And sometimes it might have been nefarious traffic or perhaps not, but nonetheless, we were able to implement those kind of technology-based solutions in a very quick way. There's probably a lot more examples probably I could talk about, but hopefully that gives a small insight into some of the work we did in response to the SBA's response to the COVID economic initiatives.
No, I think hearing that, the solutions that you all presented really were timely and helpful in terms of, I even think in terms of like what we're dealing with now with the chip shortage with laptops and computers. That's an ingenuitive way of trying to work around issues of shortages, and that's the kind of stuff we need to see more of, I think. And speaking of great advice, when you sit down with other government CTOs, what advice do you offer them on how they can successfully look to modernize their agency?
Yeah, so I think it'll boil down to really 3 foundational principles that I've looked at and used throughout my career, and I think they're still relevant. So let me just explain what those three foundational principles are. The first one is really 6 words. It's a lot of power packed in it. I'll explain that in a minute, and I'll pack it. So think big, start small, and iterate rapidly. So what does that mean? Think big is you have to have a grandiose vision. Go for the moonshot. Have a clear vision of what you want to achieve. Right. You have to start small. You have to find a use case which is driven in business. It is about impacting the business or your mission, but you have to put it in a small scale and scope so you can demonstrate that value of that mission and the vision that you raised about it. And then you iterate rapidly. As you learn, you quickly iterate and you expand that solution, both from a scope standpoint and a scale standpoint. So that's really what that means is think big, start small, iterate rapidly. And that's something that I've applied. That's sort of number one. Number two, I say, is about challenge the status quo. What does that mean? Every organization that I've been at, there's always, well, we've always done things this way. And yes, that may be right. And that may be okay for the time when some of those choices were made. But maybe in today's day and age, those solutions and those approaches may no longer be efficient and effective. With the advent of new technology, you probably can find new, more effective and efficient ways. Number three, I would say, is collaborate, and especially in the federal government. I'm surprised to see that there's somebody in the federal government at large has already done something that you're planning to do, or is already investigating or researching into it. So really, those three principles are what I would give my fellow CTOs advice on: is think big, start small, iterate rapidly, challenge the status quo, and collaborate and find partnerships. It also, by the way, it also means partnering with your industry partners because they have a wealth of knowledge, they have a wealth of best practices also that you can apply.
And I think in terms of the collaboration with the private sector and with industry, I think that's another thing I'd like to know is you provide advice about how government CIOs and CTOs should operate, but in terms of the private sector, do you have any different advice for the private sector?
Actually, I would not change the advice too much, other than the few nuances that we in the public sector deal with, like, for example, contracting and acquisitions. That's a nuance which is very specific to the public sector, and it is there's no ways around it, and you have to work with the contracting acquisition. So that's one thing that I've seen is different, but it really doesn't make any difference from a technology standpoint. The second thing that's different is really the way we do budgeting in the public sector, which is the 12-month appropriation cycle, which leads to the so-called 12-month money that you have to work with. So those are the two nuances, but they have nothing to do with technology. So really, my advice wouldn't change if this was a private sector CTO that I was advising on what to do for modernization.
No, I think this excellent advice for day-to-day operations and strategic planning for agencies and the private sector. I want to take it a little bit outward in terms of more of a policy perspective now. And on top of being CTO for SBA, you also serve on the Technology Modernization Board, which oversees technology modernization funds, and that provides loans to government agencies to assist them with modernization. Can you explain why the creation of the Technology Modernization Board and the TMF are so important for modernizing government IT?
Yeah, I think it's a very important aspect, Jordan. I'm glad you brought that up. So first and foremost, the Technology Modernization Fund helps with one of the key problems that I just talked about just a minute ago. The appropriation cycle sort of gives you the 12-month money. And so assuming you are lucky to get a full 12-month appropriation, you only have the 12 months to use that money or apply that money, right? And oftentimes, IT modernization projects tend to last several years, or at least you need sustained or committed funding and a strategy that is committed to. So that's where the TMF comes into play by being able to provide that sustained and committed funding over multiple years. So just to give a case in point and reference, the TMF, as you probably know, in March of 2021, with the American Rescue Plan Act, was funded with $1 billion as part of the TMF fund. And then prior to that, we had about $175 million appropriated. So in essence, it's a fairly large fund, the TMF fund, and it is essentially focused around, broadly speaking, modernization across the federal IT landscape. I mean, yes, it seems a large amount of money by the numbers in of itself, but when you contrast it with the overall IT spend in the federal IT landscape, it is a good amount of money, but still certainly not going to be sufficient to help every agency, reach its modernization objectives. So that's one area where the TMF comes into play. The second area where the TMF comes into play is the fact that the TMF board, myself and my board members and my colleagues, we have a wealth of knowledge and expertise and experience doing those modernizations in our agencies or in the private sector or a combination thereof. So what we can do is advise and guide these agencies as they are embarking on their modernization journeys as well. And last but not the least is we can connect, since we have a good view of what's happening in the larger federal landscape, we are able to connect those agencies who are, let's say, launching a new modernization initiative with another agency that has already done something like that. And so they can learn from each other. So those are some of the ways that the TMF and the TMF board is helping drive modernization across the federal landscape.
So I might get you to answer a couple of inside baseball questions then. The TMF board has currently awarded 18 projects across 10 federal agencies. Can you touch on when you expect the board to make more awards?
Yes, so we are actively reviewing proposals. In fact, I had a TMF board meeting just a couple hours ago itself today. And so the proposal process is high level, really a two-stage process. So there's an initial proposal phase or IPP, where an agency makes a short and a brief statement about what they're planning to do, why they're planning to do, define the business case, and so on and so forth. And so the board looks at it and makes a disposition. And let's say we say, advance it to the next stage, which is the final proposal phase, and which is the FPP. And then we look at the more detailed proposal. And mind you, we have intense and healthy debates in the board around these proposals, because ultimately we are if you will, the custodians of a fairly large investment fund. And we're trying to make sure that we are judicious in its use, and we are also being equitable as we apply the TMF funds across the large landscape. I just want to make a slight correction when you mentioned, as a loan. So when TMF was enacted under the NGT Act in 2018, I believe, at that time we had more of a loan model, meaning the agency that was awarded TMF funds were obligated to pay back. So it was a loan. As of last year, in March of 2021, when we got that $1 billion infusion in the TMF, we changed slightly our payment terms, or rather relaxed some of those payment terms for a variety of reasons, including the fact that most agencies were, gearing up for the COVID response in one way or the other. And we also wanted to see the modernization be accelerated. So we have a little more flexibility now in the current version of the TMF. So it could be, a partial loan, if you will. So the agencies have a little leeway in being able to, repay, if not the full amount, but a partial amount.
No, I'm glad you clarified that in terms of making sure that industry knows that there have been changes for flexibility there. So it's a great point to make. I appreciate that. I think, as you're aware, as a couple of weeks ago, we saw the announcement of the new IT modernization caucus led by Representative Connolly and Representative Issa on the Hill. Outside the Technology Modernization Board, if say you're going to Congress or talking to policymakers, what are some other ways you believe the federal government can look to further incentivize agencies to move to modernize?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Jordan. Certainly money is one thing, which is an important component in modernization, and we kind of talked about it here just a minute ago. I think in a broader sense, the IT modernization agenda is a leadership agenda. And what I mean by that is really it belongs with the agency leadership. And to be more specific, what I want to point out is that Of the many things that have happened in the last roughly 2 years across the globe with the global pandemic, one of the conclusions has been that IT's role for any or all organizations across the globe, doesn't matter if you're private sector, public sector, not for profit, academia, education, regardless of whatever your mission objectives are, IT has a very critical role in your mission delivery. And that's one of the things that has been proven in the last 2+ years or 2 years with the pandemic, as all businesses, all entities, all organizations of all size across the globe had to, pivot to respond to those changing business needs. We at DSP also noticed that in areas where we had a modernized foundation, we were able to respond much more nimbly or in an agile fashion and address it very quickly. But in some cases, we still also had the traditional architectures, and those were a little more difficult to adapt or pivot to quickly. So what I'm trying to say here is that the leadership priority needs to include IT modernization is really what I would say. The second aspect of this is also cybersecurity. And the reason I also want to bring that up is I think the events of the recent past 12, 14, 18 months have shown that regardless of the size of your organization, you may be a very small organization, you may be a very large organization, a global organization, it really doesn't matter. Cybersecurity could have a debilitating impact on your organization's ability, right, to even survive sometimes. So that's the reason I bring that up as well. And I think it goes hand in hand with modernization. Traditionally, we've seen the IT houses that are not as modern as they need to be tend to have a higher degree of vulnerabilities from a cybersecurity standpoint. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody who was modernized is having a higher cybersecurity profile. I don't want to reach to that conclusion either. But it is certainly you are in a better position if you are in a more modern IT setup. So certainly I would say is one way to sort of accelerate that outside of the funding thing is make this as a leadership priority.
Yeah, I was actually a very excellent point you brought up about cybersecurity a couple of weeks ago during the State of American Business series on the competition here at the Chamber. We actually heard a great conversation from former CIA staff about the need to modernize cyber and part of also the conversation. I had a chance also to sit down during that event with former Representative John Delaney, and he talked about COVID-19 really being the accelerant to digital transformation, and that we saw digital transformation happen on a private sector scale much quicker than we would have seen originally. But taking things back a little bit to the government, one of the issues we have heard a lot about in this time is the time it takes for modernization to occur. In your experience, what are some of the ways we can look to help shorten modernization times?
Yeah, again, that's an excellent question here, Jordan. So let me just sort of unpack that from a high level. First and foremost, usually it is not technology in of itself which takes the longer time. And what I mean by that is it is usually you need a combination of organizational change, cultural change, and also business process changes to go hand in hand with the technology changes that you're trying to introduce. And it's my experience that often it is the organizational change elements, the cultural change elements, the human elements. Those are the longer lead items. And mind you, technology in of itself cannot necessarily be the be all and end all of those organizational change initiatives. And so they are really critical. So what I'm trying to say is that it's a balanced approach where you take the people side of things, the process side of things, and the technology side of things, and we combine them to deliver the transformations, right? So what I'm trying to say also is the fact that yes, you can accelerate technology implementation in of itself, but my experience has also shown that those necessarily are not sustainable if you've not got the corresponding organizational culture and the business process and policy changes that need to go along with it. So certainly one of the ways, at least in the federal government, that I would see us being able to accelerate change is, make changes at the policy level, make changes at the organizational level. And the example would be, like I talked earlier, having the agency leadership include as one of their priorities to have a modern IT organization, for delivering better citizen services. So those are the kind of things I would think are really going to be important.
I think you've brought up excellent points today about both the private sector and the public sector of ways that we can really embrace cultural change in terms of IT modernization, but also some of the practical steps that can be taken, especially things like implementing cloud and increased funding across the board. Mr. Gupta, thank you very much for your innovative leadership. We've all been lucky to have you at the helm of technology over at SBA. And I thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me on, and I'm happy to be able to share our experiences at the SBA.
Well, we look forward to working with you in the future on this to make sure that we modernize government. I want to thank all of you all today for joining as well. If you'd like to learn more about what CTEC is doing on issues like artificial intelligence and digital transformation, I encourage you to visit AmericanInnovators.com, where you can learn more about things like our new AI commission and our digital transformation work. And I also look forward to seeing you all again next time, in which we'll sit down with FTC Commissioner Christine Wilson to chat about things like data privacy and AI. So once again, thank you for joining and have a good afternoon.